If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 3 and discuss what we've learned about the first acts, last acts, and sequences. We'd love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, why don't you start us off by telling us what your big aha moments were with respect to the beginnings and endings of stories?
Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed my topic this season. I am endlessly fascinated by stories and how they work, and it was such a joy to spend 10 weeks looking at just the beginnings and the endings of stories and discovering how they work together as a unit. Now, I think the biggest lesson for me this season has been getting clarification on how the beginnings and the endings work together. Now, I'd always known that they were a unit, and, for novelists, they're literally bookends. And I always knew that the beginning set up the story and the ending paid it off. And I'd heard, and I'd even used the terms mirroring and rhyming to describe the nature of the relationship. And these 2 terms, mirroring and rhyming, were always synonymous as far as I could tell. And before this season, I accepted that. However, now I see a difference between those 2 terms, and I've even added a term. So let me do a recap of them. First, there's the mirror. And this is when the end of a story, the entire last act, is an exact mirror to the beginning of a story. So the entire first act. The same events happen, but in reverse order. An easy way to remember this is by using numbers. So the beginning, the plot points happen in a sequence, right? 1, 2, 3. Those same plot points are repeated in the ending, but in reverse order, 3, 2, 1. Or, since we're all writers here, we can think of a palindrome. Level, race car, kayak. To say, you've got a one way going in, it's the same thing. Going back the other way, it's just in reverse order. You know what a palindrome is. An example of mirroring is the movie The Social Network. Now, we didn't do that one on the show this season, but John York offers it up in his book, Into the Woods, How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them. He offers that one up as an example. The second concept is rhyming. Now, sometimes the last act of a story will have the same plot points as the first act, but they're not in reverse order. The order's kind of jumbled up a bit. The last act as a whole is not an exact mirror of the first act as a whole. That said, the last scene is a mirror of the first scene. A good way to remember this is to think about words that rhyme. Alive, drive, beehive, right? It's the end bit, the "ive," that's the same. And an example of this is Good Will Hunting, or Lost in Translation that we did last week is also an example. And the third concept, and this is the term that I made up, it's echoing, or the echo. And this is when you have stories where the endings are generally reminiscent of the beginnings. They're not connected by literal repetitions of scenes or plot points. Instead, they're connected by repetitions of theme or an idea or a mood or a symbol. The end still makes perfect sense given the beginning, but the connection is less tangible. Obviously, to remember this one, just imagine an echo. I live on an island, and I remember when I was little, whenever we went to the seaside, I would always shout into the cliffs, especially if there was a cave in the rock face. It was really fascinating to me the way my voice sounded. It was my words and it was my voice, but at the same time, it wasn't my words and it wasn't my voice. I could kind of hear the words and they were kind of recognizable, but the voice wasn't. So you know what an echo is. Hopefully it makes sense in relation to a story. So an example of echoing would be the water horse. But if I think about it, the Born Identity might also be one as well. I'd have to go back and rewatch it, but I suspect it probably is. Okay, so there is a topic about the beginnings of stories that I didn't touch on this season. I just kind of ran out of time, but also because it's a hard topic to talk about on an audio only podcast. And that topic is how to craft the first 10 pages of your story so that you can hook your reader and ultimately sell your book, because it is your job to sell the book. You're either selling directly to a reader if you're an indie author, or you're selling to an agent if you're going the traditional publishing route. In those first 10 pages, you're trying to convince the reader to make a purchase. Or you're trying to convince an agent to offer you a contract. That's what I mean by selling. And once you've signed with an agent, those first 10 pages will sell your story to a publishing house. Now, this is a really important topic. Your career, if your goal is to be a career writer and earn a living in this racket, your career depends on your ability to hook your reader in 10 pages or less. It is crucial that we get this right. If you're querying an agent, you get one shot. That's not me saying that. That's how it is. If your submission gets rejected, that's it. It's game over. You cannot query that same agent with that same book. You might have spent 5 years writing the manuscript, or more than 5 years, but because you didn't know how to hook the agent, that was it. You struck out. Too bad, so sad. Now, the same goes for an indie author. When you get a reader's eyes on that free sample, that free preview that readers see on Amazon, you gotta hook them. You've got to get them so interested in your story that they make the purchase. And yes, there is a way to do it. It's a tried and true way to do it. And I have spent the last 2 years and many thousands of dollars studying it. Now, I was doing all that for me so that I can put it to use in my own work. But I've gotten a lot of questions about this. So what I've done is put all the information together in a webinar. And it's called Hook Your Reader in 10 Pages or Less. And I'll be offering it again early in 2023. I don't have an exact date for it yet. But if you're in my inner circle, or if you want to join my inner circle now, you will be the first to hear about it. So if you're interested in joining the inner circle, the address is valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. Okay, Melanie, I think that's it. What about you?
Well, I learnt a lot this season with beginnings and endings. And I started the season with a false belief that the ins and outs of stories usually reflect each other. And I learnt that there can be a great deal of variety in the way beginnings and endings lead a reader into a story and then escort them out of the story. So I liked it when you presented Stephen Pressfield's quote about the beginnings and endings being similar, but as far away as possible, and that they both have to be on theme. And what I noticed the most was how much variety is contained within those 3 points, that there wasn't one movie this season that entered the story and left the story in exactly the same way. And like you gave detail just before, we found some great ways to describe the beginnings and endings depending on the effect a writer wants to create in their story. And as you mentioned, there was the mirror, the reflection, the echo, to step in and out, and the rhyming. And creating that language around the beginnings and endings has helped me understand how I need to think about the effect, and then see how that effect is achieved in existing stories. So I learned a great deal this season about beginnings and endings.
Ah, that's awesome. So, bottom line here, just remember the beginning and the end of a story work together as a unit. They either mirror each other, or they rhyme, or they echo, but they are a unit. And if you separate them from the rest of your story and you look at them together, they have to make sense. Why? Because the beginning plants a question in the minds of your readers, who then read the book to discover the answer. And it's the end that provides the answer to the question you planted in the beginning. All righty, Melanie, you studied sequences this season. What did you discover?
Well, so this season I looked at sequences using the 3-act 8 sequence structure. And I found that very helpful, to something to give me a framework to at least enter the movies that we watched this season. But I just want to go first over why I actually wanted to look at sequences. And I believe that a sequence allows writers to manage chunks of text and to navigate through the vast middle of the story. And being able to break acts into smaller chunks that sit between a scene and an act help people piece their stories together and manage the story through edits and rewrites. Now, again, I'm going to go over some things that I covered first up in the season, but I think they're very valuable. So sequences are units of stories. So from the smallest to the largest, the units of stories are a beat, and a beat is a moment of action and reaction between characters, and a series of beats make a scene. So with a scene, there is a value change from the beginning and the end of the scene, and that's what makes it different from a beat. Sequences is a number of scenes which build on each other. The sequence has the same structure as a scene, so an inciting incident, complications that result in a crisis decision point, a decision and a resolution, and they are focused on a single central action. The act is a major division of drama, which also contains several sequences, and the act is part of the larger story structure. And then you have the story, which is a connected series of events told through words, written or spoken, imagery, still or moving, body language, performance, music, or any other form of communication. So, the biggest difference between a beat, scene, sequence, acts, and a story is the degree of change or the impact of a change in a character. The larger the unit of story, the larger the degree of change. So there were so many good lessons that I learnt this season, and each film we studied provided me with a new take on how a story is constructed. There are some essential elements for each sequence in a story, like we saw in most of the movies this season. So, for example, the introduction of the inciting incident of the story is usually the point where the first sequence finishes and the second sequence starts. The second sequence presents the predicament the protagonist faces, and sequence 3 reinforces the central dramatic question for the movie, and so on and so forth. Now, the essential elements in each sequence depend on the genre of the story being told. So, Tootsie and the Bourne Identity were excellent examples of all the elements of a story generally being in the right place and staying true to their genres. Now, I did cast a very critical eye over the Blair Witch Project this season, and there were some things that were left out. However, there were some very important things that remained in the film that were more than enough for the audience to get the full effect of the horror story. The rising tension and the single central actions driving each sequence was easy to identify, and it made a great deal of sense. There were some interesting uses of literary devices this season as well. So we saw dramatic irony used to good effect in The Bourne Identity, farce used in Tootsie, and the linking of scenes in The Guardians of the Galaxy and The Waterhouse were also excellent examples of ways to construct or change your story. The Waterhouse also used a framing device that becomes evident when looking at the sequences in the film, and how that's used and the effect that it has on the story also become evident when you break it down in a particular way. Now, Goodwill Hunting caught me off guard when it shifted the conflict away from Will and onto Jerry and Sean. And so I asked myself, is the story being told properly if the protagonist isn't the key person in a sequence? And I came up with yes and no. And again, I think every unit of story has a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist of all of the sequences or scenes and acts doesn't have to be the story's protagonist. And why? Because of who generates the conflict and who is the subject of the conflict. So stories are about conflict, and we as writers should understand who generates the conflict and who is subject to the conflict in each and every unit of the story. A similar problem arose in Lost in Translation, where Charlotte's character arc or her changes are bigger than Bob's, and Bob's the protagonist. I think this is a problem in that movie because stories are about change. And if the largest change occurs to a character who isn't the protagonist, then the audience stops focusing on the main character and focuses on the secondary character. And in Toy Story, I looked at how each sequence asked a central dramatic question that was answered in the next sequence. So there was very much a propose a question, answer the question, and then propose another question pattern as we go through each of the sequences of the movie. So, Valerie, how did you find the focus on sequences this season?
I found it really interesting, actually. Writing a novel is a big project. It's massive. And it can take many years, especially when we're just starting out. And, we're learning how this whole storytelling thing works. What I like about this sequence approach is that, and sequences, is that they're a happy medium between scenes and acts. They help us break down a story into more manageable pieces without being so small that we lose the forest for the trees. This doesn't mean that they give us a formula. What they do is help us better understand the form of stories. Now, I'm particularly interested in sequence 3. I want to know how that one works more. And I'll be talking more about that in future episodes. One thing I do want to note right now, though, is that like almost everything else in story theory, the term sequence can have two meanings. So, first of all, there's what Melanie has been discussing this whole season, breaking a story down into 4 acts, 8 sequences. Each act and sequence has a particular function, and this is very common for modern films, but it's also common in novels. Now, the other way to think of a sequence is quite similar to that, but there is a bit of a difference. It's simply a grouping in your story of between 2 and 5 scenes, typically, that help you get from point A to point B. And it may or it may not correspond with the 8 sequences that Melanie has been focusing on here in season 3 of the show. So I just wanted to mention that for what it's worth.
Yeah, and I agree. I think but having a framework of something, like you said, even just understanding 2 and 5 scenes that create a sequence is a framework of sorts. And I have found having some framework this season to be very helpful especially in analysis. So, and we don't just do analysis of movies, we actually do analysis when we're doing our own edits. So having something to hang an idea or to start as an entry point into your story is, I think, a really key and good thing to have. Each movie this season offered a variety of key takeaways. I started to recognize by using the 3-act, 4-act, 8 sequence framework. And as I mentioned, using a framework to analyze or plot a story is not about having a formula. It's about using a tool that's been tried and tested over many years and seeing if it helps you. Now, I love sequences because they have allowed me to focus on structuring my own work in progress. As a result, I don't have a saggy middle. The action continues and builds to the crisis point at the end. And finally, the more you use a framework or a tool, the more accustomed you'll get to it, and it will start to become second nature. And this season, I've really honed my own ability to identify sequences in movies.
Before we close off here, I just want to circle back to a question that you asked me earlier this season. Melanie, you asked if I was using what I'm learning through my study here on the show in my own work. And I am so glad you asked that. And the question has been on my mind ever since. Because honestly, I really thought that was understood, but obviously it isn't. And I just want to drive the point home right now. Yes, I mean, obviously, I find story theory interesting. Stories and what makes them work or not work is an endless source of fascination to me, and I am never going to get tired of it. But I'm a writer. This is not a hobby for me. I'm not a film reviewer. I'm not a movie critic. I am first and foremost a writer. So I'm studying all this stuff so I can write better stories. And I'm happy to share what I'm learning so that other people can write better stories too. The market right now, I mean, to say it's flooded with books is an understatement. I did a little research. As of May 2022, hold on to your hat, there were 48.5 million books listed on Amazon. 48.5 million. Now, only, 1 to 3% of them are really any good. An easy 75% are dreadful. We all know this. And the rest range from pretty good to, hey, not bad at all. Right? What this industry and everyone in it needs is more writers who know how to tell better stories. We don't need more writers slapping any old thing on a page and uploading it. That's not what we need. We need writers. And when I say we, I mean us as writers, we need it. Agents need it. Publishers need it. Most of all, the readers need it. We need more writers to learn the craft and understand how to tell a better story. That's what Melanie and I are doing this whole show for. So story theory, and the whole point of it, right, is to enable us to improve our storytelling skills. So don't ever stop writing in order to study story theory. Instead, study theory with a goal in mind. So, for example, if you're not happy with the ending of your story, study endings and how they work with the beginnings. Study within the genre that you're writing in, but also study outside of it. And then bring whatever lessons you've learned back to your manuscript. If you want to be a writer, you have to write. If you're not writing, then you're allowing story theory to become a form of resistance, and that is not good. And the last thing I want to say is this. When I first started studying theory, and I would learn a new concept, and, to be perfectly honest, there were times I was afraid to use the concept because when I learned it, it seemed really obvious to me. And I thought, well, if I can see it, surely the reader will see it. Surely I have to not use that thing so I can surprise my reader. I know, I'll innovate. Good one, Val. Please, 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 I'm begging you, believe me when I say that no, it will not be obvious to your reader. Because it isn't obvious to 97% of the people who call themselves professional writers. I'm not saying that to be mean. There are 48.5 million books on Amazon. That speaks for itself. Now, since May 2017, I literally have been studying stories in depth every single day. It's not an exaggeration. This is my life. This is what I do. I love it. And with all of the studying I'm doing, if a concept wasn't obvious to me, even though I'm studying this every single day, and I'm writing and I'm reading and consuming stories constantly, then it won't be obvious to my reader, and it won't be obvious to your reader either. They neither want nor need to know how the sausage is made, right? They just want to pick up a good book and get lost in the story. They want a great story. That's it. So when in doubt, please lean into the theory, not away from it. All right. Melanie, what do you have on tap for season 4?
I just want to say that I have really enjoyed my topic this season. I have really enjoyed studying sequences, but I'm even more excited for next season because I'm going to be studying subtext. Because people don't always say what they mean or mean what they say. There is text and there's subtext. So the words, which are text, have definitions, but the meanings can change due to the way words are used and the association readers give to them. So that's the subtext. Actions and behaviours are also used to convey alternative meanings. So come up and see me sometime next season as we can learn how to employ subtext so that you can enhance your storytelling. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more. What about you, Val? What are you going to study next season?
Well, this past season, I studied the beginnings and endings of stories. So I think it only makes sense that next season I study the middles.
So that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Home Alone. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook as Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more and not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.